The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
To this point, we've talked about individual users innovating. We had a brief excursion into communities, which I'll remind you about today. The big news really is that communities and users innovating collaboratively are really what's going to drive producers out of innovation in many fields. This is sort of the major sort of shift in focus. Now, you remember, I think, that I talked to you about individual user innovators. And so you may remember John Haysham Gibbon as an individual user innovator. Now, the economics of this story are that John Haysham Gibbon could only innovate up to the point where his design costs matched his potential benefit as an innovator from, in his case, the heart-lung machine. If the project was bigger, as design costs went out further, then basically the producer in the old days would have to take over. Because the producer could spread costs from his innovation across many potential customers. So we showed you earlier that, well, still, people like John Haysham Gibbon would innovate because producers wouldn't at the beginning of a market that was small and uncertain. So they had to do what they could. And then in the days before the internet, it typically was the case that individual users who cared a lot about something would tend to innovate on their own, couldn't find others who shared their interests. Now, with the evolution of the internet, what we've gotten is the equivalent of low communication costs. John Haysham Gibbon, as an individual user innovator, did not have to communicate with anybody else because he was just working on his own. Communication costs were irrelevant to him. But still, the internet has brought communication costs down to a great extent. And as a result, all of a sudden, people can communicate with each other and collaboratively innovate. And that allows them, each of these boxes now is what each user can afford to do on an innovation project that's larger than any one of them can afford, like Linux. Now, prior to the internet, there were times and places where users got together for some reason and were able to innovate as a group. Often it was in sports, where you had another reason for getting together, namely you were at a meet. And so physically you were together. And when you saw that, you saw the same kind of collaboration going on that you now see much more broadly via the internet. So I'm going to show you a cool video to give you a sense for that pre-internet time and the interactions that happened there. So this is 5 minutes, and it's from Dogtown and Z-Boys. And that was a movie about where this kind of skateboarding that you see Tony Hawk's and people doing, that's on these half pipes, these wooden half pipes. You've seen that as an extreme sport, right? Well, basically, before that, what people did when they were skateboarding was go down hills, perhaps, or sort of go on the flat, but it had nothing to do with this sort of 3D kind of activity. And so what you'll see here is how that evolved. And if you look at it carefully, what you will see is lots of instances of collaboration in a very informal way. People are watching each other and saying, wow, that's cool, and in that way reinforcing sort of a good direction to go in. They're giving each other feedback, and they're all collaborating on building the idea. So at the same time, of course, in this particular instance, they're busy breaking the law, but that's a separate matter, and let's look at the video and see about that. So that was prior to the internet. And what you can see going on there is this interaction, right? So in the case of something like a game or something that is done interactively, then what you really need is the full context in order actually to develop this thing. I mean, it'd be hard for an individual to develop a basketball game, right? Because it's in fact collaborative. Now, again, what you saw there was quite local and didn't emerge into sort of the public press for quite a long time. So the internet does two things. One is it allows people to get together. The other is that it basically publicizes them to some degree, which will be helpful for you when you want to understand who does these innovations and where they come from. Now, I showed you this in the first lecture. If you recall this example, this was post-internet, and it also shows a direct competition between producers and users. So the story, if you remember, was that kite surfing, very like this case of skateboarding, kite surfing was developed by users entirely. They figured it out. They figured out, it involves these small boards, and it involves sort of several control wires and large kites which actually lift you out of the water, and where you can do tricks once you're up in the air. So they're being used for all sorts of things like mountain boarding, that is going up mountains and sort of along the beaches in carts and so on and so forth, lots of stuff. Now that was developed, it's an individual sport, but people did get together, but it's something that you play in part on your own. What then happened was it became a popular sport, and so manufacturers came in and started to, in fact, provide people with new designs for boards. They sold this stuff about $2,500 a copy instead of people making their own. And they each had two engineers, and the attitude of these little companies was, okay, get out of the way, the big boys have arrived, production has come. And there was a guy at MIT who had been involved in kite surfing from the beginning, and he didn't like that idea much, and he did something very, very simple, which you can now do in the internet age. So here were these distributed people, and he simply put up a website. And the website he put up said, if you want to post a design, feel free. And so people began to post it all over the world. So all of a sudden now you can get from all over the world contributions to this thing. It's not just a local area. And here's Sebastian in Argentina, a super high aspect ratio inflatable design for mountain boarding. And behind this sheet, what he has is designs. He has his design and what he thinks of it and so on and so forth. So there's patterns for the kite. And as you may remember from last time or a few times ago, initially these patterns, which are kites, which are 3D objects made of cloth, are made from flat panels of cloth, and one can sort of replicate a design by cutting out flat panels of identical sizes to the one who designed it. This is now done via CAD files were exchanged, and which are now made on sail loft floors. So the result is nowadays what you can do is you can, all over the world, exchange the same design, make it locally, test it out, comment, modify. Hugely different than the sort of traditional situation. And what happened in this particular case is that many people joined this who had really good aerodynamic skills. Aerodynamicists from the top departments around universities, aerodynamicists from NASA joined this thing. And they were all sharing, and they brought along tools like these kind of vortex analyzers and so on. And basically what happened was this collaborative effort blew the standard effort by 2 engineers in each company out of the water. So that what happened was the companies then said, in effect, well, we might as well adopt this innovation from the producers rather than try to do it ourselves. Okay? So this is what I mean by communities being the big shift here, that are really taking the sort of the reins away from producers in innovation. Now, one last slide from earlier. What you see here then is that what are the advantages of users? Many users can cover much more of the design space for whatever it is. And producers, you heard from Andrew last time, producers sort of tend to want to patent things, hide them, keep them secret. And so producers really cannot take the innovations of other producers to produce an optimum solution. They're sort of stuck there with what they have. Okay, so now, if you go back a bit, what we start to see in our research is that within each kind of an area that seems exotic and narrow, there in fact are many innovators. They were invisible, they didn't get together, but now they do. And what you see here is different areas. You see printed circuit CAD, you see pipe hanger hardware. Pipe hanger hardware? Yeah, that's the stuff you use to hang. You've seen when you walk down these halls in a big building, pipes often are hanging from the ceiling. That's what that is. There are people collaborating on that, which is quite amazing. A lot of people, many more people is the point than are within the firm's R&D departments. Right? So it was really funny. Each of you probably think, when you think about your own particular area, oh my God, nobody will care about that. Right? People care about the damnedest things. You know, there are enthusiasts for Saabs, of all things. Can you imagine that? There are enthusiasts for lawn tractors. There are enthusiasts for, wait for it, mailing machines. Hacking mailing machines. So, you know, you should not assume that there aren't a lot of people out there innovating in an area that you might care about. So here's library IT systems. You know, when you go into a library, it's those systems that you use to get your books. Lots of libraries innovating on how to do that. Software security features, surgical equipment, outdoor products. Now this outdoor products one is quite an interesting one. That one has a 9.8% response rate. But that is a sample of the people on the mailing list from the German equivalent of the LL Bean catalog. So if you think to yourself, these are ordinary outdoor products like sleeping bags and boots and so on. And when you see that 10% of the people who buy those things are innovating on them, that's huge. That's got to be 100 million people worldwide, which is so much more than all the R&D people in all the outdoor sporting equipment areas in this or any parallel universe. I mean, it's just huge. Yes?
You say that 10% of people are innovating on them. Is it innovation that goes back to the design of the product? I.e. they innovate on them and then the manufacturers release the product with the innovation? Or is it that they just try something and keep it for themselves with the bag?
Yeah, so that's very insightful. The idea here is that users innovate and manufacturers don't necessarily pick it up, and users don't necessarily have an incentive to tell them. The thing about users is they are innovating for their own sake, and so they don't have a necessary incentive to diffuse. So what companies have to do is figure out a way to get this information. Okay? Yeah?
Is this also true about services and processes or just for products?
It's also true of services. I mean, when we looked at services, for example, in banking, retail banking, commercial banking, the users again lead. It's quite remarkable. You probably have a bank, and the bank used to send you, account statements. And if you had 5 accounts in the bank, it might send you 5 statements. But certainly, each bank would send you a statement. So whoever you dealt with, and people typically deal with 3 or 4 of these things, what you ended up with was separate statements that you had to put together. So it was users who first came along and developed the system for contacting each bank in turn and electronically populating a spreadsheet with all that and making a summary statement for themselves. And banks followed. It's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'm just amazed too. But anyway, yeah.
What constitutes like outdoor products innovation? Because when I buy a Four Seasons tent, everybody knows the first thing you do with a Four Seasons tent is you add like dynamic rope onto each of the 4 corners so you can tie it to trees, and you add rope on the inside so you can hang flashlights, and you add stuff to the inside. But I don't know if that really counts as innovation because that's just putting up the rope.
So do you think it would be convenient for you if the manufacturer did it for you?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe?
Yeah, but it does, I don't know if I pay more for it because the rope is like $2.
Okay, you might pay $2 for it, huh? Okay, so yeah, I mean, the definition of innovation is not anything to do with how important it is. It's whether it gets out into the marketplace and has some value. So it's different than the definition of invention, which has to meet some threshold. So yeah, those are innovations, and the manufacturer can say, well, do we want to add it or not? But sure. Yeah, there was somebody else? Yes?
Just to that point, I have a quick example. I mean, I belong to an extreme sort of backcountry skiing kind of group. And one of the innovations that they came up with many years ago was this airbag system for backpacks that could be used in an avalanche. I mean, recently, yesterday, I think a couple of days ago, there was a situation in Washington State where 3 extreme skiers were killed in an avalanche. But that one, no manufacturer wanted to pick it up early on. And as it turns out, the German sporting equipment company that picked it up and actually designed backpacks that could be deployed in an avalanche situation where it has essentially it's an advanced airbag system that they built. There was completely user-driven innovation. No one manufacturer innovated in that area. They used technologies from different kinds of industries to put it together. And there are now, I think, 2 or 3 manufacturers in the world who make those.
Yeah, that's fabulous. So what it does is it gives the person enough flotation to actually move to the top?
Keeps them on the surface.
Yeah,
it essentially keeps them on the top 2 or 3 feet off the snow pile as they're coming down hills.
Yeah.
I mean, it works.
That's fabulous, and it seems quite lightweight too. Yeah, that's fabulous. No, users do it. I mean, that's really the bottom lesson here. But now, okay. So a lot of users innovating then, and there's that community effect. Now, why do so many users develop products for themselves? Because many have custom needs. If you look at what a manufacturer does when a manufacturer makes a calculation, what a manufacturer tries to do is to economize on the number of models he has to deal with. And so what a manufacturer tries to do is do a cluster analysis or something and find out which sort of customers fit in which major cluster. And then they will make something like a sports car that sort of fits most people, or a luxury car that fits most people. And the fascinating thing there is that when you analyze those cluster analyses, what you find is that the people within them are not so homogeneous in their needs after all. It turns out that a lot of people aren't so happy. But the producer only needs to have them happy enough to buy that car versus another one. You know, you've all gone to the store and you've sort of thought about buying this car versus that car, and you wanted a particular feature of a different car perhaps, and you're forced to satisfice. You're forced to say to yourself, well, okay, you know, none of these cars makes me perfectly happy, but I'll go with this one. Okay? That's the dilemma that the manufacturer puts us all in. And it suits the economics of manufacturing. But within those communities, there are some people who just can't put up with it. And those are the people who then start modifying their cars or coming up with something from scratch. And interestingly enough, again, manufacturers are searching for homogeneity. So they are not sensitive to the heterogeneity that in fact is out there. But that's what's driving this massive user innovation. Okay. Now, what do you do about it? Okay, which was somebody's point. What do you do about it if you're a manufacturer? There was this case where it was a company. It was in Germany, and it was an auto company. It was presenting sort of their 5-year plan, and what happened was that the audience got restless. And what then happened was somebody raised his hand and said, you know what? Everything you're talking about doing, we've already done. And the manufacturer representative, the engineer, said, no, you have not, which had a certain entertaining quality. And he said, the obnoxious person in the audience, yes, we have. Come out to the parking lot and see. We've built them into our cars. And the engineer proved up to the task, and he crossed his arms again, and he said, no, you have not, because that's not what we had in mind. So the manufacturer isn't necessarily interested in picking up what the user has done. But if the user, in fact, can outcompete the manufacturer, and if, in fact, that is where the major innovations come from, then the manufacturer has to do something about it. So previously, we saw lead user search, and that was going out to find an innovation. In this case, what you are trying to do is something slightly different. You're trying to attract users with modifications to you so that you can see what they're doing. Okay? Now, here's an example from Lego. And this shows both the surprise of the company's response and their eventual sort of reaction that was helpful. And there's a general principle that I'll then bring out on how these kinds of systems should work. So this is Mindstorms. And do you know Mindstorms, many of you? Do you know that? Yeah? So Mindstorms is like Lego blocks, but within each Lego block they have, or some of the Lego blocks, they have sort of components, electronic components, motors or a CPU or something else, so that this thing can actually move around and sense things, and you can build things like robots on it. And it was an idea from Lego, and it was done with MIT, working on the language that was used, and eventually they came up with something quite nice. And took them 7 years to do it. And it was the Mindstorms product, which had a programming language and so forth. And it was perfect. And it sold for $200. And what Lego then did is they put it on the market. Now, Legos have always been hacked in the sense that what they are is blocks to build stuff. But in this case, something very visible happened, it being the internet age and all. And what happened was that within a very few months, 1,000 hackers were working on it. Now, they had had 7 years working on it in-house with about 7 engineers. 1,000 hackers is a lot more than 7, math being what it is. And what happened then was that the hackers quickly made it better. The hackers sort of improved it. This is now what you do with this thing. Among the things you can do with it is you can put tape on the floor, and you can actually have this thing run around what becomes a race course, because you can sort of see the thing optically can sense where that tape is and go around. And you can actually run contests. So they began to run contests comparing Lego's 7-year in development firmware with their 3-week in development user hacks. And they found, as you can see, they were running these contests. You can find that they see, that they do it twice as fast. Okay, so they're sort of embarrassing Lego. They're sort of saying, and the Lego engineers, are saying, what? Now, what happened was it became a craze, and they, in fact, were somewhat soothed by the fact that this became the most popular and profitable product they'd ever had. And MIT, I don't know if it still does, and other major universities built curricula around Legos where you can sort of figure out advanced robotics using that hardware. Became a craze among techie adults. Silicon Valley firms forced to ban Legos at work. That's how serious it was. So what did the firm do? The firm wasn't sure what to do. Very much like that engineer I told you about in the auto company. They thought maybe we should sue these people, which was the path that Sony supposedly took with something called the Aibo dog. The Aibo dog was a robotic dog, and somebody taught the robotic dog, he hacked the code and taught the dog to dance. And Sony, rather than thinking this was an improvement to the dog, promptly sued the guy. That's how you treat your customers. And in this case, they didn't know what to do, but they decided not to sue. Now, when you look outside the Lego company, and you try to wonder where 1,000 people came from out of nowhere, what you see is something very interesting. And at that time, Lego had not had much to do with it. But it was a self-organized user community, quite elaborate, not just a bunch of people hanging around a swimming pool. It was organized around 25,000 people, now about 40,000. Organized around different areas of interest like trains and castles and space. So what happened was that basically when this thing came out, there were lots of people in contact with each other who sort of went and did something about it. They began to say, this is quite interesting. Now, Lego's only interaction with this sort of phenomenon previously that you can see is called LUGNet, which is Lego Users Group Net. And they had before called themselves something at the beginning like Lego Users Group or something. But the Lego legal people got in touch with them and said, you can't do that. So the prior contact was something like, you can't do that. Anyway, here it is. And what happens next is they say, okay, let's think about how to systematically link to these people. Let's think about what to do about it. And so what they did was they set up an interface, right? So here's all this activity. And companies, historically like Ford, for example, when there's a Mustang group and all sorts of people doing all sorts of mods, they don't want to know. You can't see it unless somehow or other you can attract it or do something. So what this was an attractor, sort of a sticky binding surface that would attract people to interact with each other on your site. And so this was called Lego Factory at the time. And what it was, you can see, is you can post your design. Now, you know, all of you who have ever built Lego kits, you know that, in fact, you know, you have one of these little books, you know, this instruction manual thing. But those can be generated in an automated way. And what a user could do was post his design, like that bird, and make a kit. Lego could put the bricks that were required for each of these kits into a package. You could design your own box, and you could sell it on the website. So now what is this? What this is a way to attract people who are innovating to your site. So now you can see them. But what it also is a way of finding out which one of these things are popular, right? Because you can see the sales. So it's not only a system for user innovation collection in some sense, it's also a system whereby the users themselves, by their behavior, are providing you with market research. The critical point here is that what Lego is doing is also keeping something for themselves, right? So in effect, what they've done is they can give away the design development process. But what then do they keep for themselves? Well, they have the Lego brick. They have the brand. And so when you think about this, companies tend to think, I need IP, intellectual property, over everything I sell. But actually, the thing is, you only need something to be proprietary. And if people are going to develop for you other things that would otherwise cost you money, then what you really would like is to have them do that. Okay. Now, by the way, there's sort of a fascinating thing about Lego, because you would think, I mean, these communities have norms and so on. And you would think to yourself that maybe what they might want to do, because the brick itself is no longer under patent, that what they might want to do is buy some other compatible brick, like Mega Block or whatever. But it's sort of fascinating. For some reason, the members of these communities are really loyal to Lego. So a lesson that we will see as we go on a little bit is that you have to be sort of respectful to your community in order to get them to treat you pretty well back. Okay? So it's not that you can just steal what they do. It is instead that you sort of work with them respectfully and you end up rewarding them in some way. So if Lego, in fact, chooses to produce one of these things, they give a royalty back to the developers. Okay? Now here's another example. And what you'll begin to see here is the common thread. This is Stata. Any of you use Stata software in your work? Any? It's a statistical software package. Any of you know about R? Yeah, some of you. Okay. So it's a statistical software package. And prior to it, you know, there are all sorts of business models in that field. Another one is SPSS, SaaS. And that tends to be a closed system. In other words, you use their tests. What Stata decided was, you know what, we realize that we are not the developers of statistical tests. Our users are, epidemiologists and so on. And so what we are going to do is we are going to make a core product. And the core product is like MATLAB or something like that. It's something that has a lot of hooks on it so that users, in fact, can attach modules to do what they want to do. We'll give them tools to develop modules. They can attach them to our proprietary closed core that'll do the common processing. And that way, we'll have something. We'll have the equivalent of the Lego brick and brand. But the users will be developing for us what we need. Okay? It's a systematic way to do what users are doing anyway. Now, what do users do? Users then set up websites. The company first set up websites for them, but the users thought, well, nah, we'll set up our own. So Harvard and a couple other places have websites where people put modules they have developed, and they share them openly. Okay, so I have a test as an epidemiologist, you have a test as an X-ray guy or whatever, and you know, we post this stuff and people comment and so on, very much like the website that I showed you in the case of kite surfing. What happens then? Just like in the case of Lego, Stata watches to see which ones attract interest. Now, what does Stata do next? Well, it turns out when I develop a statistical test for myself, what I do is develop it so it's serving my purpose. Now, one of the things statistical tests do is they might blow up when there's, or give bad results when they're used in a regime that you did not intend as you, the designer. So what Stata then does is it takes the test from the user and does quality control and what they call test validation. They rewrite the user code. They put this thing, they test it across a range, they sort of integrate it into the core product. So what's happened is they have taken something that the user developed and they've taken it over and they've rewritten it so they own the copyright, and they put it into the product they sell. Now you could think that the writers of these things, the originators, might be mad at this. But a colleague of mine in Germany actually did a survey of these users and said, what do you think? And they said, this is fabulous. Why is it fabulous? It's fabulous because they acknowledge me. This becomes like a publication for me. They clean up what I have done, and they call it Joe's test. Okay? Notice now, in other words, this again is a symbiotic relationship between this particular population of customers and the company. It's a different transaction that goes on with the Lego community. So what you have to do is you have to figure out what your community wants and make a transaction setup for them that is like the one that will make both sides happy. Okay? Yes?
If there is not one central website, but different websites, how do they keep track of it? How do they make sure that they know how much user interest is on each website?
Yeah, so they visit these sites. There are only a few important ones. And then, you know, they sort of aggregate. And the people inside are knowledgeable, and they, you know, sort of have a sense for what, I think it was it Esther who said, or was it Sarah who said, you know, how do they know that the mass will want it? So again, they've got to figure that out, you know. But yeah, it's very doable. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wonder about the economics of all this, because if Stata and Lego develop the innovations themselves, what they pay is a few salaries for a few engineers, whereas
this seems, and it's plausible that they have to recognize the contribution of user-generated innovation, but that a lot of times translates into royalties, which at the end end up being a lot more money, right?
So you're wondering, is it worth it to them to do it?
I'm guessing that there's a balance because this will produce for them a lot more revenue as well. So is there any chance to understand the trade-off there, the balance between?
So that's a good insight. The thing is that the producers don't know what the users want. So what I told you earlier is that users tend to make the functionally new things. The producer, no matter how many engineers he has, doesn't know what they want, right? Because I'm off there doing something kind of exotic and I know what I need and I'm struggling with it, but I'm sort of lost amongst a lot of users. And just like in the case of the lead user, that turns out to be where the important stuff comes from. And what the producers do is they make dimension of merit improvements to those things. So once I've established that I want a DRAM for my computer, Intel will, or whoever makes memory chips nowadays, will make the more efficient DRAMs, right? And what you see here is exactly that split. What you see is the user pioneering what the test will be, which the company cannot do, and the company using its employees to clean it up, to do quality control. Okay? So yeah, that's the huge value. They don't know what to do. That's why you saw in the case of the lead user study that I showed you of 3M, that the major new innovations came from users, lead users, and incremental innovations came from inside. They just don't know what to do. Yes?
I wonder if there's a mixture of, in the user community, a mixture of individuals and companies. Kind of, are there companies consulting using Stata as a software? They create additional modules that they sell to their client. And how does that change the dynamics of kind of the user community not being just purely individuals, but you have companies in there?
Yeah. So what you see is, for instance, if the user is a company, it's an employee in a company or something like that, you will see a company engaged. You will often see, like in the case of Linux, there are many, many people, as you know, from companies like IBM working on it and so on. What you'll see is that those people contribute things that IBM wants to interface it to their needs, right? So whoever is active in this, for instance, if, as you say, it's a consultant, they will be doing what they need for their purposes. They're not necessarily insightful into what their clients need, but for instance, they would do things like easier installation and so on, if that's what they're supposed to be doing. It's quite interesting. When you look at innovations, even in wheelchairs, for example, this is how specific this is. Wheelchair innovations were, these racing wheelchairs and so on that you see now for the Special Olympics and so on. They were all developed by the patients themselves. Entirely by the patients, not by the companies. It's like, no, wait a minute, we get sued, we can't do that, forget it, right? Entirely. But the athletes who were in the chair were not pushing the chair. So the handles by which you push those things are designed by the people who have to push them. So it's really interesting when you trace back these innovations, how specific it is to the particular issue that's affecting you. Okay? Yeah?
How much would you think is it important for a company to have a good image? Like, everyone loves Lego, I guess, from their childhood, and it's easy to contribute there. On the contrary, a company like Microsoft, for example, which was quite not disliked in the user community, would they be able to set up something like a website and have success with that, or would they have to work on the image for 5 years until?
Yeah, that's a very good insight. And we'll get to the matter of how you deal with your user community. Let's go on. So now, but prior to that, think to yourself that 2 lessons here from both this thing and this thing. The commonality is that you hold something that's proprietary, and you try to enable your users then to innovate in areas where they know more. Now, there's a fascinating corollary here. We don't know how far this is going to go as users get better and better. There's a fascinating corollary here, which is in this field of statistical software development, there's also a project called R. R is entirely open source. Now, one of the things that happens, you remember I told you in the case of Stata that there's a core product that they keep closed because that's their proprietary advantage. Now, that works fine for many users, but some users, to do what they want to do, have to reach into the core. And Stata can't let them. So they get mad, and they go away, and they work with something that's completely open called R, which is a totally open source project, which doesn't have this requirement in order to maintain a profit of having a proprietary component of some sort. And so what's happening now is that the energy and the innovation level within the R community is exceeding that within the Stata community. So it's not clear over time. We are in a case now, or in a position, where this whole area of user innovation and the roles that companies play in it is evolving. And it's not clear what the stable positions are. You know? So we'll just have to see. Now, this is yet another example of the same thing. Same pattern. Users came along. There were games that were developed by producers, video games. Same pattern. They developed it as a monolithic product. What happened was users hacked it. They didn't like it the way it was. So the first one to be hacked, I think, was Castle Wolfenstein, a game, which they hacked and became Castle Smurfenstein. Instead of these dangerous kind of people, they had wonderful little blue Smurfs wandering around. The company was most annoyed. But then as they hacked, one company finally said, in the case of something called Counter-Strike, you know what? These users are not only hacking, they're starting to publish hacking kits so that others can hack our stuff. Maybe what we ought to do is we ought to get with the program here. And so what they did was they separated their games into 2 components. One component was the story component, in effect, where you decide whether what is going on there is that it's a space game or a game among children on Earth or whatever it might be. And the other is sort of the engine, the physics engine, the thing that says that when you throw an object, whether it's a ball or whether it's a spear or whether it's a spaceship, it has some sort of an arc to it. When you move or walk, here's how you move. That stuff. And so then what they said was, we will supply games, the top module, plus the engine. And then if people want to play by putting new mods on top, they will have to buy our engine. So what happens in the end is that it enhances the value and the longevity of the engine, because people are doing new things with it. So again, you see this common thread here. It's that the companies own the engine. Now, in that area, it's quite interesting. There have been open source efforts to make engines, but the field is moving quite rapidly because you need a new engine every time you have a new generation of processors and graphics chips and so on. So somehow or other, the companies are hanging on with these sort of base modules. You can actually have your users do things like assist with product support. One of the things that producers are very concerned about is they say, well, we have to make a homogeneous product, and if we end up providing a range of options or allowing users to do so, how on earth are we going to maintain this thing? How are we going to provide customer service? The fascinating thing is that these communities tend to provide service on their own. They tend to help each other. So you can sort of say, well, this is my part of the system, I provide service on that, and then basically the users themselves provide the service for the stuff that they develop. It's really an interesting new world. Now, to your point, Michael, and to the point of others, you have to understand that the interests of a host community or a host manufacturer and the user innovation community may not be aligned. Okay? So this is where the ability to sort of have a good relationship with these people starts to come in. One really good example is BMW, because it turns out that people race BMWs, as of course you know. And what BMW does is they have engine chips, as does every car. And the engine chips have things in it like speed limiters, engine rev limiters. And they have engine rev limiters so you won't blow up the engine. Well, if you're trying to race, you really don't want to be in that safe zone. You'd really much rather be sort of on the edge of blowing up, right? Because then, hey, you might win. So what users were doing was putting in their own chips, which got rid of the rev limiter, and racing like hell, and occasionally blowing up the engine. And then what they would do is they would put back in the old chip, and they'd bring it to the dealer, and they'd say, I don't know what happened. I was driving to the supermarket, and it blew up. Yeah.
I actually did this with my old
You did it?
I had a separate engine control unit in the trunk that I would swap out whenever I went to the dealer, and I learned from the Audi World Forum there's a specific way that you can start up the car and run the fan cycle a few times so that it doesn't cause any fault codes in the onboard diagnostic, because back in 2001 the OBD sensors weren't quite as sophisticated as they are now, and the car wouldn't know whether you swapped out the ECU or not.
Uh-huh. And then why were you doing all that secretive stuff?
I increased the horsepower by like 90 horsepower at the engine.
Right, and why were you not wanting Audi to know?
Because they would avoid my warranty.
Yes, there you go. So your interests were not aligned with, shall we say, Audi's, right, in that instance. Now, this often happens. And so the question is what to do about it, right? And so basically, companies have experimented. And they've sort of learned by experience that it doesn't pay to fight with your users. Okay? I mean, it's fascinating, but it doesn't pay. There seem to be people that you're trying to sell to are your users, oddly enough. And it also seems like there are more of them than you. And so a wonderful example of this was, that was sort of an object lesson to companies. I don't know about the Microsoft lesson, I'm not sure about that, but the lesson to companies was AT&T, one of the things that people found were phone phreakers. Have you ever heard of phone phreakers? Phone phreakers was pre-internet. And what phone phreakers was the company AT&T introduced those tones. You now have push buttons. Before that you had the dial. And the tones told the toll operator things like you've paid your toll. So if you figured out the tones that would say, hey, listen, I just put some money in, then the thing would go ahead and let you make a call to Brazil or whatever you were trying to do. And it turned out that a particular tone, namely a tone 2400 hertz, I think it was, that was produced by a whistle that was sold in Captain Crunch cereal. Was perfect for that. Now, Steve Jobs and his friends went further. They made what we call blue boxes, where you actually could, do a lot of things. But anyway, the Captain Crunch whistle was really good for saying, I just put in a quarter, for God's sakes. And what they would do is they set up almost the equivalent of a primitive internet. What you had was party lines or conference calls that could last for days. You just set it up and everybody knew it was there and everybody would get on and interact and so on and so forth. AT&T got really upset. So AT&T started to try to track down and attack the hackers. The hackers found this had enormous entertainment value. And they therefore turned from trying to understand the phone system and play with it to trying to attack AT&T. And AT&T learned to deeply regret it. They thought this was a really, really not a good idea. And people learn from that, So the thing that you want to do is you want to make it easy for people to do the things that are in your and their joint interest. You want to provide them with tools that both sides find of interest. And then, fascinatingly enough, the community will support you and protect your interests, it appears. An interesting example of that by a guy was written up by a student of mine who's now a professor in Wharton, was the example of the Tivo community. And as he explains it, Tivo, Tivos are these things that record programs and time shift and so on. They're basically big disks. And the way they make their money is that for $10 a month or whatever it is, they sell you information on what show is on what channel. Now, they're pretty nice to their user community, and they've designed their system so that you can put in bigger disks and do all sorts of things like that. And there's a user community. And the user community kind of likes them. Which is fortunate because everybody knows that you could find the same information they are charging you $10 a month for on the web for free. So basically, if the user community wanted to, they could bankrupt Tivo. But what the community site does is it doesn't allow those hacks on the site. It's actually actively protecting sort of this shared interest. And that's where you want to get to, right? There will be divergent interests, but what you want to get to is the idea that we're in this together, we're kind of helping you, you're helping us. That's why when I talked about Stata and the fact that they attributed the tests, and that when we interviewed the users, or my colleague in Germany interviewed the users did not feel ripped off. That's where you want to get to. Nowadays, a lot of companies basically do sort of rip off the community. And the first thing that they do when they come up with an innovation, the users that the company wants, the company takes it and doesn't acknowledge that the users did it. There's no reason for that. It is convenient because somebody worries inside, oh, well, maybe we're going to have our IP challenged. Or, oh, maybe people will think that I'm not doing my job as an engineer if I, in fact, admit that it came from somewhere else. Regularly, when I talk with companies, they will say, oh, yes, this and that and the other thing came from users. And then you will ask them, did they ever acknowledge it? And the answer is uniformly no. No, we wouldn't do that. Well, we got to learn to do that. Now, innovation communities don't need your help to become active. Does your product have an innovating user community? Check the web, right? Check the web. You know, when you Google Mustang Ford forums, lots come up. Lots of modding and so on. When you Google things that you wouldn't think anybody would care about, like John Deere lawn tractors, clubs all over the place, right? And look what they're doing. Again, they are protecting John Deere and themselves. Discussions on bypassing safety switches of the operation of equipment in unsafe manner or condition, including but not limited to bypass switches, overriding the governor, or lack of shields, are not permitted on this group. Isn't that interesting? I mean, this is independent of John Deere. So now, when you look, what you find is that they're messing around, and there was a particular engineer in John Deere who was saying, you know, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but they were saying, you know, we've got this really advanced thing that we're doing. We are developing GPS guidance for lawn tractors so that they'll mow the lawn for you and sort of not run over the children and not run over the dogs and not run over the plants and things like that. So I urged him to look on the web because, in fact, experts are not in your company as well. We all go home at night and we're all pretty good at what we do. And there were half a dozen clubs who had projects exactly on that topic. Okay? So why not link? Okay, so now, happening all over, you remember the Microsoft Kinect controller? Do you remember that? It's so cool. I mean, these are depth cameras, as you know, and they're used with the Xbox and so on to pick up gestures. And people, if you go over to the Media Lab, there are dozens and dozens of them in there being used for all sorts of things. Well, once they were posted, you know, once they started to sell this thing, a couple of days later, somebody posted a reward for the first hack, to open it up and do stuff with it. And immediately people did it. Okay, what happened next? On the day it went on sale, Limor Fried of Adafruit, she's an open source maker of open source hardware, announced a $3,000 cash bounty for anyone who creates and releases free software allowing the Kinect to be used with a computer instead of an Xbox. Microsoft said, we do not condone this. We will work closely with law enforcement, which didn't bother anybody at all. And then Microsoft changed its mind very quickly. Anytime there's engagement and excitement around a technology, we see it as a good thing. It's naive to think that any new technology that comes out won't have a group that tinkers with it. So what you have to do now, and let's just have a discussion in the last very few minutes, what you have to do is you have to think about your products, how you can hook up with communities. It's not that you have to build the communities. The communities are typically there. But what you see from what I've told you in these examples is that the communities can be linked to in ways that are mutually beneficial. Companies can then allocate some of their R&D effort, in effect, to the communities, because the communities can do it better, and companies can do what they do better on their side. And that's really the solution to this thing that I showed you in the case of the kite surfing example, where I said that the users were driving the producers out. Don't try to do what the users do. Try to work with them and in a way that rewards them so that they'll continue to treat you nicely. Okay? So I'm going to give you now like 5 minutes to talk with each other about how this might work in the case of your company or the company you used to work for. Okay? Think about whether there is a user community. Think about what you could open up versus keep private. And try to think if this thing would work. Go ahead, say hello to your neighbor once again. Get started.